Uh, yes. Oh, the microphone. Uh, so, as you know, yeah, as you know, we're going to have a bit of a discussion about uh, chapter three, and chapter three, I acknowledge that's an extremely dense and highly abstract kind of argument. Anyone has had a look at chapter three, just to in case you want to intimidate yourself? Yeah, that's but to be honest, it's super abstract, it's very dense, and highly theoretical, even I would say meta theoretical. We'll talk about what meta theory means versus theory, but to be honest, it's not saying anything too strange. It just tries to lay down the theoretical foundations for what we actually have already done, and we're going to expand that. The If you may remember, we had this, and also, of course, this would the purpose of this session would be to help us get prepared for the second assignment, which has 4 questions, and each question requires only 400 words. It's like an open question or open quiz question. I could have possibly turned it into quiz questions. Let me see. But yeah, it's the first time, so we can turn it to a number of quiz questions with options, or we can just leave it as it is. I don't know what would possibly be more attractive to you guys or more manageable. But I think anyway, regardless, I think the conversation today would help if we can actually manage to decipher the complexity of the arguments in chapter 3, and then next week would be chapter 4. So chapter 3 lays the foundations, theoretical foundation for chapter 4. And what's the purpose of chapter 4? It's actually to do something like this, but in a more general way. You may remember the conversation we had. You may remember the conversation we had about what was that, the academic knowledge production, and we ended up developing this kind of model. Anyone can speak to this model or related to that academic knowledge production thing, the case study we had. We did it a couple of times, if you may remember. You remember the guy who was being interviewed by ABC? He was talking about how knowledge production is kind of have become very much monopolized by the publishing corporations, and what else you would remember? In the older system, when everything was publicly funded, um, the academics practically owned the journals. They were establishing them. There was very high quality work going into them, making those journals, academic journals, very reputable, high profile. Um, uh, we send the man to the moon, etc., etc. Right? So it was the heydays of when the academia was kind of publicly funded, run by the academics very much. Kind of, I wouldn't idealize or romanticize and say there was no problems. Or, yeah, it had a lot of problems, perhaps the influence of the government was much higher because government was funding. So we were also funding development of nuclear bombs as well. But there was a lot of great advancements in modern science. Now, gradually, these privatizations happened and corporations emerged, and they were taking those journals as their own platforms for making money. And academics who used to be working for the good of the public, to give service to the public through their research, and then they were in control. They lost that control, and those platforms, those journals were kind of expropriated, like the land that you grab from the peasants and make them landless. And then they become vulnerable. They become so weak and then disempowered, and they have nothing to exchange but their own labor. So they have to migrate to the cities and work for wages, very low wages. So that seems something similar to that happens here. So as the academics lose control over their institutions and of course those outlets, publication outlets, the academic outlets, then they have to be kind of they find themselves being exploited in a system that now they have to publish or perish, and they have to compete to increase not only the number of their publications, but also the citations. So you have to promote your work yourself. In the past, it was, well, the quality works speaks for itself. Come and discover me. Now you have to actually become a marketeer. In a promotion application, I filled out recently for myself, I had to actually mention how many times my articles have been posted on X, and there are altimetrics and things like that. So that metrics are very important. And I hate X. I mean, look at just Elon Musk now siding with Trump. And promoting far-right extremism in England. You might have possibly seen the news. So why I should be proud of my work when it is cited 10 times, or not cited, even shared 10 times on X, Twitter, or Facebook, or those sort of things. So you see, this is all now kind of extravaganza. The quality is going to is kind of lost, and it's all about profit making. And so that was, now it is a capitalist mode rather than a kind of a communist, collaborative way of doing things. Now, but also you heard from that guy that a group of the academics started to working on what they call diamond open access, right? That they would just say, well, no, we're not going to work for you. We're going to reestablish those platforms we used to have. We're going to, actually in the current system, people are unpaid. It's people have to produce things for free, then have to pay these corporations to get their publications published, and then the same institutions that are funding the publications of their outcomes are the ones that have to also buy that, have to subscribe to those journals. And so it's a double dip for them. So these academics said, no, we're going to have our own way of doing. So we're going to set up what they call diamond open access. And collectively we produce and we publish and we make that. If our free labor is going to fund to provide or to fund corporations, why not actually that free labor would be directed towards producing something that becomes publicly available. So their reaction, the reaction of the corporations. We also had this pirating. There's a lot of websites like, I recently found something called Anna's Archive, and you can download almost anything. So people are actually making those expensive publications publicly available. So there's a resistance here happening, right? But then what was the reaction from the capitalist corporations was that they adopted the language and they say, okay, well, we'll go for gold open access, and again, you universities have to fund us. I have to pay for it, and then we'll make that available. And now they have taken that gesture that yeah, we're for open access. Now we're making the knowledge that is being produced openly available for them, but behind the scenes, a lot of money goes into that. So and then they have adopted that language. They have actually tried to co-opt and compromise, etc., etc. And it's still, as you may remember from that conversation on ABC, the guy was saying that still people are finding it extremely difficult to dedicate themselves to diamond open access, because the diamond open access journals are not still that reputable. We've lost those that those high profile, reputable, high-ranking journals to the corporations, and still people are under pressure to publish their articles and books in places where they say they're high-ranking publishers, which are actually those corporations as high-ranking publishers. So you see that this model explains things very well, and it covers all that the conversation, and you see that this is what we call a perversion, that something that could have actually be done much more effectively in the interest of the public, and in a much more democratic way, is kind of lost or partially lost. There's of course some resistance, but without that, and still you see that the free labor goes into this. A lot of time that is unpaid, simply because if you don't publish or perish, if you don't, you lose your job. You never go to promotion. Every year there's a performance development assessments, etc., etc. How much you publish, in what kind of journals you publish, how many times your publications are cited, etc., etc. So people are finding those institutions, those so-called public institutions, are subservient to the corporations. The pressures they're putting on the academics to publish with them because they are much more reputable is actually giving service to those corporations, that their purpose is just higher levels of profit. So this exploitation that happens, so if you're a Marxist, if you're a Marxian, or if you follow a Marxian value theory, what would you do? You would mostly focus on this side. You would mostly focus on the way that things happens inside the institutions, how the laborers are being exploited, and how the value that goes into their work ends up in the form of massive amounts of profit and money, etc., competition. So you see, this is what even Marx himself acknowledged, that limitation. That he says that I'm only focusing on the inner workings of capitalism, where the production happens, where the exploitation happens. So that's why Marx is accused or criticized for being a productivist, only focusing on production and not seeing the other sides of the story. Well, okay, that's a little bit of far-fetched criticism of him. I would say that he actually paid attention to the rest of the story, but he just didn't incorporate that into his value theory when he was talking about how value is being extracted and produced and circulated and so on and so forth. And by value, he meant what the capitalists meant, what goes into the products. So it was a kind of theory that Marx said, okay, let's accept what capitalists considered as value. Already Adam Smith has considered labor as the source of value. And then let's see how this system, by looking at the inner organization or the inner working, what kind of contradictions emerges out of that. So he didn't question the value of value. He didn't say, no, there is no value in this. It's a capitalist way of, he said, well, let's accept that and see what happens. And then he amazingly put his genius into 3 volumes of Capital, and he showed that there are very much inherent contradictions, and it results in huge crisis. But when it comes to other aspects, of course, Marx talked, especially more as he moved more towards the end of his life, he paid more attention to colonialism, subjugation and oppression of women, minorities, ethnic groups, etc., racism, etc., etc. So he paid a lot of attention, and his politics, his revolutionary politics, it has more to do with this side than his value theory. It's hard to turn his value theory to a revolutionary theory. So you see that Marx didn't combine. It seems that he was kind of working on 2 kind of separated universes. Later on in 20th century, as the working class became more affluent as a result of their struggles, and they become middle class in 20th century, a lot of critics of capitalism started to also criticize Marx because of that kind of making himself handicapped. And then they say, well, what about identity? What about culture? What about women's rights? What about the civil rights? And you see that those new generations of critical theories, especially in Europe, and also in the US, they started to pay attention to things that happens outside the factory, because, and especially further down into when you go into the later stages of later decades of 20th century, you see that a lot of the industrialization happens in the West. A lot of those industries are moving outside to the global South, and they are becoming more invisible to the eyes of affluent, critical intellectuals in the West. And so if the production is happening in Indonesia, if the Nike's already gone there, if Apple's already gone there, if Microsoft's already gone there, if the car manufacturers are already gone there, so they're not that visible. And they call that era the post-40s era, because it's kind of was kind of, what they were seeing, right in their own context. And as the result of that, they say, okay, perhaps the production is no longer that important, and we have to pay attention to other forms of discrimination. Well, Bourdieu came up with the idea of social capital, cultural capital, because now these are the things that are important. These are the things that if you have more social capital, you better connections, social connections. If you have more cultural capital, symbolic capital, that is the one that these sort of things make you where you stand in the society, up or down, rather than the wages, rather than the money that you get, because we're now all benefiting from the welfare state of the 20th century. So the welfare state is looking after us. Why we should be worried about our material conditions anymore? That's the global South's problem. So so as capitalism swept the the dirty production relations underneath the carpet, meaning sending them to the global south, they became less visible to the intellectuals in the West. I'm not questioning the fact that there is gender discrimination. I'm not questioning there are racial, there have always been. But you see, what I'm questioning is the gulf, is the chasm, is the separation between our understanding of how exploitation happens and how expropriation happens. So the new generation of the post-Marxist and neo-Marxist, even cultural Marxist, post-colonialist, anti-colonialist, they all were paying a lot of attention. That became the subject of their theories and theorizations and discussions and protests, of course, and resistance. So we lost this sight on how still exploitation happens until when you get into the 1990s, early 21st century, with the demise of the Soviet Union, you see that and also globalization, you see that most of jobs start to become, even in the West, most of jobs become precarious. Now we're talking about our younger generations having no proper future, no job security, no housing, etc., etc. So the material comes back. The boomerang that the West sent to the global South is coming back to the face of the West, and then causing problems. And the material is also becoming important. And we see that if the more we exploit the poor worker in the global South, the more the capital has the incentive to go there, and the more we become deindustrialized, and the more we become jobless, and the more we lose our ability to collectively put pressures on capitalists at home in order to get something from them. So you see that it is extremely, extremely important to go integrative, and to bring these two sides back and see how they are related. But actually, there is no exploitation without expropriation. And it's still, what drives expropriation is the exploitation. What drives the expropriation is the exploitation. Because you can't really, if you don't dislocate, let's say, the academic laborers, and if you don't take their public institutions and opportunities away from them, you can't exploit them. So what drives expropriation is exploitation. So we have a parasite that, as we said before, is killing the host. So without the host, there is no parasite. And to think that, true value production is just an imagination in the minds of some dreamers, it's nonsense, because capitalism cannot exist without free labor, without a lot of sacrifices that we do. And those sacrifices, those free labors, are the kind of they are, I would say, they are the infrastructures for true value production. Because if they are liberated from capitalism, they result in much better flourishing, self-fulfillments, etc. So you see this. So what we want to do here now, we want to actually see if we can. Well, this came out of a conversation about a case study. If we want to, in chapter 4, if you look at the graphs, you see graphs that are similar, the two graphs that are similar to this, but they are more general. And we want to see if we can actually develop something more general. But before doing that, we need to know what kind of meta-theoretical backing we can have. And you may say, what the heck meta-theory is? Anyone knows what method theory is versus theory? Okay, in simple terms, I'll tell you something that it stands with you until the last moment of your life. Okay, that would be method theory is a theory about theory. So if a theory is about how to explain something, how to explain homelessness, how to explain unemployment, these are middle range theories. Okay, but a meta theory is a theory about how you can explain unemployment. Okay, and I'll tell you why it is important to pay attention to meta theory. If especially you want to do honors later, you would be required to do a research project. And one of the very first things that you want to choose is actually where you, meta-theoretically, where you are going to stand. Have you heard of, possibly I'm actually, yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, so if you may remember, sorry, I missed that part. If you may remember, what actually is happening here is a decommonization. So in the natural state of things, you expect that people would just collaborate with each other equally and freely to produce something good for themselves. But when that is taken away from them and they're brought into the capitalist relations, what happens is a decommonization happens. That those commons, those ways of living, commoning and living in commons would be lost. And the opposite to that, so if in just one sentence you want, or one word, you want to explain what capitalism is, or what capital is, it's just one word: decommonization. Decommonization explains what capital is. And what would be the counter-capitalism, a true counter-capitalism, is recommonization. You go back to where you could actually collectively and freely produce true value for yourself and your community. Well, that might sound very idealized, but because we are very get used to what capitalism has imposed on us, and it has its own problems. Of course, there is no society without problems, but this is the difference, is that it's a self-destructive system we want to choose, or a system that is based on justice, has its own problems, but will get involved in making and remaking and making it better and better. It's not inherently problematic. The problems are things that can still be reflected on and solved. Whereas on the other side, the problems are very inherent, very embedded, encoded into the system, because it's all about profit making, the profit motive, competition, win or die, kind of dog situation. So yes, I think I've already said so. Instead of looking at capitalism as one big unchangeable system, we can break it down into different parts or modules and see how they are interacting, similar to what we did here. So we are breaking down the system into modules, into processes and mechanisms, and then we see how they are actually interacting. That is a much better way of understanding, much more comprehensive way of understanding capitalism. And we can then see capitalism is full of contradictions, which can lead to crisis, but also create opportunities for change. Yes, I think I've already spoke to these slides, that Marx paid more attention to the inner working and left the rest to the non-Marxists or post-Marxists, and then we need to expand the value theory. Okay, possibly I needed a slide on what meta theory is before I forget. So what was meta theory compared to theory? Theory about theory, or theory about how to theorize things. Okay, now if you want to do an honors, there are possibly 2 or 3 ways of doing it. One is called positivism. Have you heard of that word? the versus constructionism. Unfortunately, the academia is in social science very much divided between these two poles, and they're missing the middle one, which is critical realism, and we will discuss that later. So anyone can tell us what's the difference between positivism and constructionism?
Positivism is the scientific method, the scientific process of finding like knowledge or gaining knowledge, while constructivism is more of like subjectivism. Yes, you kind of construct knowledge as you go, or like yeah, you kind of
Okay. Yes.
Is constructivism trying to kind of improve the world? It's not trying to make a point that
No, not necessarily. It's a method of understanding the reality. So, like positivism, but there are very stark differences between the two, huge differences. Positivism, as you said, it belongs to the 20th century, 19th century, maybe even earlier. Social sciences were trying to mimic the natural sciences. They were looking for natural laws that govern or rule our social relationships. They even came up with 500 laws of societies, and then they just discarded them because society can't be really explained under laws and rules. So it's about whatever you want. The best knowledge is the one that gets as close as possible to what can be empirically observed. Like a scientist that goes to the lab, puts the drug into the mice and sees the reaction of the mice. So that you can measure everything under positivism. If something cannot be measured, something cannot be proved or disproved scientifically, most of the time quantitatively, that's not science. That's pseudoscience from that point of view. So there are still very strong elements of positivism in our research projects. You perhaps do a survey, you measure people's opinions about something or some issue, and then you also measure their socioeconomic status by their income, how many houses they have, how many cars they have, etc., etc. And then you turn everything to numbers, you crunch those numbers, and you find correlations between them, and you say, oh, well, it seems that those have dogs as their pets versus those who have cats as pets have a greater tendency to vote for Democrats or Republicans, and those sort of things. So the correlation kind of, you look for things that are measurable, observable. And the opposite side, you've got the constructionists. The constructionists say, well, that only touches the surface, those measurements and things like that. We need to get into the minds of the people. But at the end of the day, regardless of what reality is, people actually have to deal with the reality as they perceive, as they experience. So you go a little bit more, even well, much more than that. You become very qualitative in your method as well. And then you want to see what's going on in people's minds, how they experience things. For instance, think of unemployment, right? How would you study on unemployment under a positivist approach versus a constructionist approach or constructivist approach?
Where positivists would look at like ADS, like statistical data that
yes.
While if you're a constructivist, you would probably interview people who are.
Yes. So you go and interview people and say, how are you experiencing unemployment? What are its impact on you and your family? And how your perception of unemployment affects other aspects of your life. So you go into the details. You probe very qualitatively and deeply into their perceptions and experiences. The lived, see, you might have come across with this term, the lived experiences of people. Now, whereas the positivists would say, okay, well, let's look at the rates of unemployment, the fluctuations there, how market is working and not working. Are we experiencing recession or not? Inflation? You may even consider, for instance, if the unemployment is higher among people who are less educated, and then you have to go and measure how educated or uneducated people are and see if there is a correlation between them, and etc., etc. You may come up with very advanced models, actually, and that can explain things to some extent. Now, critical realists, what do you expect of a critical realist as something that stands between the two and says, no, that is too, positivism is too extreme, constructionism is too extreme, I want to do something different. That is called critical realism. That is what I normally encourage my PhDs and honors students to go for, because that's the much more balanced way of doing things. A critical realist would say, okay, reality is there, yes, we accept that, and reality is not going to be totally dependent on how I perceive things. Unemployment is unemployment. It has some material basis, real basis, regardless of how I experience it or perceive it. I acknowledge that different people experience and understand unemployment in different ways. So what I'm going to do as a critical realist, I pay attention to the facts, the structural facts that actually can explain why there is unemployment, but I also want to know how people experience it. So it's a dialectics between the reality that it's out there, and partially, or I would say to a great extent, is independent of how people think or experience it, and then their individual behaviors and their individual perceptions. So, and the interaction between the two. So as a critical realist, you become dialectical, which means that you see how structures influence people's perceptions and experiences, and how experiences actually influence the structures and bend them. Similar to that model we had, right? People's behaviors and reactions and resistance against the structures, but also how structures condition their actions. There's a very famous quote actually from Karl Marx that shows that you can actually consider him as a critical realist. I'll get to that quote later. Now, getting back to our slides, yes, Marx considered capital as a process, and that was a very good thing from him, because he said, well, if you may remember, he said the difference between capitalism and non-capitalism is that you've got, is this being recorded? Yeah, okay, yeah, it is. Yeah, in capitalism, we start with money. We take money and we spend it, and then we produce commodities, and then the purpose of that production is not to satisfy our needs or exchange that commodity with another commodity that we couldn't produce in order to satisfy our needs. So, and the purpose is just to make more money. So he showed that it's a process. It's a process rather than a thing. Whereas prior to him, they were thinking that capital is just a thing. You know, the money that you spend, you invest in your production or in your business, right? But as you can see, the reason that he talks about this, and which is a good progress, but because he is very much focused on the inner working. You see, there's no much of interaction between this process with the rest of life, with the environment, with the societies, with the communities, with the politics. And there are other types of hierarchies, the other types of processes that are involved. So because he was focusing on the inner organization, he is considering capital as a process, but not as a combination, as a module of many processes interacting with each other. That's why we need to actually consider. That's our approach here in this course and in this book. The book argues that actually capital is modular. What do we mean by modular? It means that, like, there are multiple interrelated processes, and the two major one would be decommonization and recommunization. And we need to see if we need to develop a model that actually shows us the components of it. So it goes beyond just capital is a process. We say it's multiple interrelated process and mechanisms. Now you say, what exactly we mean by processes and mechanisms? These are two important concepts that keep emerging in the book. And we need to, again, that sound very intimidating, but if we can actually clarify what we exactly mean by process and mechanism, we have actually empowered ourselves intellectually in order to better understand the reality. Now, in order to make that modular framework, you're already familiar with Aristotelian doctrine of causation, right? The four causes, right? The material, the efficient, the formal, and the final. And this has a very great advantage. These actually are the Aristotelian four causes can aid one of the biggest controversies in social theory. Well, if you may remember, I just told you that Marx was kind of criticized for being very much productivist and paying too much attention to labor as the ultimate source of value. Okay, he didn't deny that nature has value, etc., etc. But he said it's the labor. Nature can't turn itself into products, right? Into chairs and tables and computers, etc., etc. It's the human labor that gets involved and translates that intrinsic embedded value in nature into a much bigger level of value. So, but then others came and said, well, what about nature? I mean, we can't really ignore that. We can't really put nature in the background. What about the work of women? I mean, if the women are not, or the housework is not there, who's going to reproduce the laborer? Yeah, the laborer produces value inside the factory, but who is going to reproduce the laborer? Also the public spendings, public institutions, the communal work that happens, a lot of things that, if you belong to a community, a lot of care happens there, the care work, the affective work, if you like, etc., etc. So are we going to just say, well, there's just the preconditions for that? But then they say, well, let's consider, even there was a guy that was saying that even the horse, a horse that is put to work in a farm is a laborer. You can attribute labor to a horse because it's the work of the horse that actually makes the farming possible, or the cow, or whatever that you use in order to prepare the land. So, but then there's a problem with that. And the problem is that the value that nature brings on board, the value that women's work or affective work brings on board, is very different to the type of value that the labor puts into the commodities, into the production. Okay, and then they say, well, let's if we were measuring that value in terms of the labor hours, how many hours goes into the production of, for instance, this hat, then why not also measure the labor hours of the women or the housework behind that labor? And but then how would you do that with the nature? Is that the working hours? I mean, the nature seems to be maybe the calories or the energy flows, and that you see these values are very different in type, and and uh, and you don't really you end up doing a flat ontology. That is called flat ontology. Means that you put things together that don't belong, they're not of the same type. You put the apples and pears together and you end up finding yourself in kind of a very difficult situation. You can't really say the effective work can be measured the way that the labor in the factory, inside a factory setting, can be measured. Or the work of nature can be measured or assessed in the way that the work of the laborer in the factory. So it's called flat ontology. That means the word is flat. Everything is the same nature. But we know that's not possible. But when you actually look at Aristotle, because Aristotle differentiates between different types of causation. We say that it's a labor is actually of the type of efficient cause, right? Whereas the nature's contribution is of the type of the material cause. The communal work, the care work, the affective work is of type of the formal cause. The politics behind it is of the type of final cause or alterity, if you may remember. So the good thing about the Aristotelian approach, it actually helps us to differentiate between different types of different sources of value. Just keep this in mind. I know it raises many more questions, and then you would say, so what? And then how are we going to end up finally doing all the assessment, etc. We'll get there. But just to keep this in mind, that one of the advantages of the major advantage of using Aristotle is that we say no. We bring all of them together as sources of value. We acknowledge all as sources of value, not just labor. But we also at the same time acknowledge that they're different in nature. So that's something to bear in mind. I guess you must have a question or something, no? Yeah.
I'm just a bit confused.
Yes.
So if we bring sort of like types of labor into four categories, maybe it's just a word, and I'm just a bit confused about. I get that this is like 19th century sort of ideology, but if we're kind of categorizing work into like gender, saying what kind of men's work and women's work, if we're using that to like analyze things that are happening nowadays, wouldn't that just be quite counterproductive to like women's rights if we're going to measure it like that and say that this labor's worth this much, but this labor's worth this much?
Yes, that's
you know what I mean?
yes, that is flat ontology. That's what actually you say, okay, we're actually equating the two. We are dealing with them in the same way, whereas we need to acknowledge their differences. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, okay. But we'll get there, because in chapter 6, I don't want to confuse you more. In chapter 6, there is a fight between feminists over this. Those who say, well, actually, you have to allocate some wage or add to the wage of the laborer, something that would compensate for the labor of the women that goes into that behind the scenes. So you have to pay them, which is within the capitalist system sounds kind of a progressive. Even in the third world society I come from, I remember my dad used to get an extra amount of wage because of my mom. So my mom's work would be also, it was small, it was not that much. I don't know, in some other countries that might be also the case. In places where the welfare state is stronger, they even, if for instance my dad dies, my mom keeps receiving his salary until she dies. And if inside the house there is a girl, a daughter that is not married, they would still keep getting that salary, that final salary. There is no superannuation or things like that, but people after retirement, and this was the case here as well. Some of our colleagues who got retired, they got retired with this kind of system. They received their, I think possibly 60% or 80% of their last salary until their death. And their families might even receive that. So that sounds very progressive, right? But it is still, you're still saying that you're equating the value of women's contribution to something that needs to be waged.
I mean, what I'm kind of asking is, in this class,
yes,
are we looking at those sort of four causes of value as a thing that we should be using to analyze things in the world? Is that looked at as a progressive thing? Yeah.
Yes. Because as you said, it differentiates between their types. It won't equate them. It would just say, okay, if the women's work is of different type, then we have to actually make the system, reset the system, or restructure the system in a different way. So we have to move away from waging. Okay, the redistribution of the rewards, and also we have to think of the redistribution of the ownership. So that it's the whole community, it's the workers and their families that own. And this by ownership, then therefore we better acknowledge the effective work, the care work. Okay, instead of just compensating with some extra wage, extra money. Yeah.
So why is women's work and men's work different? That's because of the reproductive parts?
Yes.
Because only women can actually bear children?
Oh no, their work in the factory is not different. Yeah. What we're talking about is the care work, that reproductive work itself, and not their work that goes into the factory. If they're inside the factory, they're like a red label, it's just a female label. Yeah, sorry for the vagueness. Okay. The second thing that we need to do is to, we have already talked about this, the true value, and bringing that to the equation. And as we said before, the sources of true value are not just imaginary. You can refer to so many examples. There are very strong elements of true value production that happens in the world. Historically, you can look at the indigenous ways of living, moral and philosophical schools of thought that they talk about what should be valued and what shouldn't. Theological liberation movements like, the original Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, etc., historical legacies of lost and achieved causes, anti-slavery movements, the 19th, 20th century revolutions and uprising, working class struggles, civil rights movements, feminist, socialist, anarchist movements, etc., etc. So many of such movements actually showed strong elements of true value. They can actually be sources of inspiration without worshiping anyone, without thinking any one of them it was excellent or perfect, but they were actually pursuing, they were promoting causes for higher levels of social justice, for more freedom, for more sustainability, if you like, etc., etc. So the elements of what should be considered as true value are actually embedded in a lot of. So we need to not only study how capitalism works or fails to work, we also need to study movements. We also need to study struggles. And by looking at them, then we can get some good insights about what we should consider as true value. So it's not just, and also, of course, we can extend our imaginations and say, well, socialists were saying some good things, but they also failed in that they were this way. Our imagination would say that if we actually do socialism in a different way, we might be able to achieve what socialism failed to achieve. Okay, so it's not like the history is fixed and any failure ends the conversation. It's interesting. We invest a lot of hope on capitalism to fix itself, whereas capitalism very, very clearly says that it's based on greed. Greed is good, as Milton Friedman said. I mean, Adam Smith said, "Is the reason that there's food on your table is not because of the benevolence or kindness of the butcher or the baker. It's because of their self-interest." So you see, that's the capitalism 101, and we invest a lot of hope and efforts in order to reform that system. It's like, we're begging the tiger to become vegetarian, and spending a lot of efforts and time and energy and money. Whereas, other systems that very clearly and bluntly pursued social democracy, pursued social justice, than democracy and sustainability. We get so disappointed with them if they fail in one way or the other. And we say, oh, no, they cannot be fixed. They cannot be reformed. We'll just keep begging the tiger to become vegetarian. So the bars gets very, raised much higher when it comes to assessing such movements. Now, another thing, as we said before, need to do, or actually I had that in here, it's critical realism. Critical realism can also help us with this modular understanding because of a number of reasons. Again, I'm going to intimidate you with some scary words here, but then we'll try to decode them later on, very soon, in a second. First thing first, it has a stratified ontology. Anyone knows what ontology is? Yes? No. Yes, that was episode. Yes. Ontology is about the worldview, what the world is, what the world is made of. For instance, your ontology can tell you, like Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as society. It's all individuals coming together. In that worldview, a society is like a bag of potatoes, unrelated, and it's just individuals. When the individuals come together, they make a society. So there's nothing. The sum is not bigger than, what is it? The entity or the totality is not bigger than the sum of the parts, right? Or you can say, no, it's very collective. A society is collective. So you see that it depends on your ontology. So ontology is the way you comprehend, you understand what the reality is made of, or what the reality is. So critical realists, they have a very stratified ontology. When they look at the society, they say society is multi-layered. It's not just one layer. And I'll explain what are those layers. They consider 3 layers for the society, for the reality. Then the second aspect of critical realism, they pay a lot of attention to causal powers. They love talking about cause and effects. And a theory that doesn't talk about cause and effect is not that really a very serious theory, to be honest. It's all about interpretations. You see, many of the theorists, when they look at the societies, they like the clergyman who looks at the text and interpret it in different ways. They come up with different terms or terminologies to explain things, to interpret things, not explain. A lot of our new social scientists do the same. They interpret how power works, or they interpret how power and knowledge are related. They interpret how people interpret, etc., etc. So there is not much. So critical realists are serious about finding what causes what. But they differentiate between social sciences and natural sciences. The type of causation here is different to the type of causation you see in the labs. Okay, we'll get there. And then they have a method that is called retroduction. Okay, what is production? Pro means forward. Okay, duction or dos or Doctate means bringing. So production means bringing something forward. You produce something, you bring something forward, right? Retroduction means to bring something backward. What does that mean? Well, they look at the events and things that happen. They look at how people experience things, and they try to explain it by moving backward to the root causes. So retroduction, moving or bringing backward, means to go back to the cause of the effect, to start from the effect, okay, and then move back to explore the causes. I think that's something every science should do, right? So retroduction is not something strange, but it's something that they take pride on. So and the fourth thing, as we said before, they're neither positivists, they don't reduce things only to observable things or observed things or measurable things. And they are not constructionists. They don't just limit themselves to how people feel about reality or how people experience the reality. They think reality does exist behind people's feelings. So, and then therefore become dialectical. So that's a very powerful kind of a meta theory, critical realism. It's a very powerful meta theory. And I think we talk about this unemployment, how we can explain unemployment in terms of positivism, how we can explain it through constructivism or constructionism, and how we can explain it in terms of critical realism. I'll later on in our slide we'll discuss more examples. So a philosophical approach that seeks to understand the world by distinguishing between the real and the observable. So they say what we observe is not necessarily the real. A great example of that, would be something that we all experience every day. I'll tell you. Let me see if. Okay, I think I've already talked about inner and outer, and then we want to bring both the inner and outer workings of capitalism together. Yeah, let me jump to this one. As I said before, critical realists consider the world, the real world, the social world, hierarchical, multi-layered, and they consider 3 layers here. The first, the surface layer that everybody experiences on a daily basis, they call it the empirical. Okay, the perceptions, experiences. A lot of research happens here in social sciences. A lot of research happens here. Then they say behind the empirical, there is the actual. These are the events and non-events. I'll tell you what are they. And then they say behind that, deep down, is the real or the deep. The real or the deep. These are the causes. These are the root causes are here. If you're really a social scientist, you really need to dig deep here. Don't stay just there. Not even here. You have to get here to see the very, very root causes of your problems. Okay? A war happens, you say, well, it was because of some weapon manufacturers trying to make money by arming people and putting them against each other. So that was the money-making machinery of the weapon makers. So the war happens, people experience the war, how horrible it is. You want to explain it, you relate it to some corporations and weapon manufacturers. But then down deep, why we have manufacturers doing that, weapon manufacturers doing that, right? So it's the then you get into the system, the capitalist system that actually has provided the settings for the emergence of some such corporations. A lot of critics of capitalism, they criticize corporations. Yeah, today, everyone criticizes corporations. Even the far right criticizes big corporations, even if they have their hands in the pockets of the corporations. But what they miss, the point they miss, is that it's the capitalist system that is actually has provided the breeding ground for it. So those corporations have no choice but going for exploitation, because they would lose the competition. So now a very daily based kind of experience. Every day we wake up and we experience days and nights. Now the days are warmer and hotter maybe, and brighter, and nights are darker and possibly colder, right? That's the empirical experiences, and we have perceptions for that. We call the darkness night, we call the brightness day, etc., etc. Right? Now, what happens in terms of the events? Well, then you explain that in terms of, okay, how I'm going to explain the way that I experience days and nights. Well, yeah, I have to look at that. The sun is apparently rotating around the earth. It comes up on the eastern side and then goes in the west, goes down in the west, right? That's the event. What is the non-event? Well, when the sun is missing, right? When the sun is missing, it's night, and then the sun is not up there. So that's the non-event of it, right? And then you say, okay, but then why the sun? And then later on you discover that it's the opposite. Actually, it's the earth that is rotating around the sun. Why these planets and stars are rotating around each other? And then you end up in something, a concept which is more abstract, and it's very hard to pinpoint, called gravity. So it's finally we realize it's gravity that is the causal mechanism, the underlying structure behind the rotations. And then still today, even after Albert Einstein explained how it works, we still have problems explaining what the heck gravity is, what actually pulls things together. And then you say because of space-time is bent or something like that, but then you see that the quantum physicists have problems with that, and they're thinking of a particle that might be responsible for gravity, etc., etc. So still the jury is out. Still we don't know what gravity is. So you see, the deeper it gets, the more powerful it becomes in explaining, but it also becomes much more difficult to grasp the nature of it. It becomes more abstract. Okay, but it still has a powerful explanatory capacity. So critical realists would say the upper level emerges out of the lower level. It's impossible to experience not to experience days and nights if there is no rotation. If there is no, and it's impossible not to have the rotations if there is no gravity. So the rotation emerges out of gravity, and the experiences of days and nights emerges out of rotation. So they call it emergence. This is a very interesting concept in the philosophy of sciences. I can explain many hours about emergence because it's a very mystical thing. Now let's see. Actually, Marx. I intentionally chose this because this example corresponds to what Marx did. Well, in economics, you say what actually determines the prices or the values of products, goods, and services. We say it's because of the supply and demand, because of the market exchanges, price fluctuations, etc., etc. So you can see these are the things that we measure. We can easily measure. We can experience. We can observe, and positivists would love to do that. Okay, or on the surface we see economic inequality growing, people's income, income gaps between men and women, income gaps between the majority and the minority, etc., between the working class and the upper class. Unemployment rates fluctuate, for instance. You see that these are measurable. They can be seen, they can be observed. Consumer behaviors change from preferring one product against the other product, etc., etc. And then you say, why? What is behind that? What are the events and non-events? So this is the empirical level. What happens at the actual level? What are the events and non-events that happens? Well, it's even, you can say it's related to the production of the commodities, how capital circulates, how labor is exploited that causes economic inequality, the suppression of alternatives as non-event, the other ways of doing things are suppressed. So that's why we have ended up, suffering from unemployment or suffering from inequality. Otherwise, we wouldn't. So that suppression of alternatives is a non-event. The crisis that capitalism can avoid by, for instance, government saving the corporations, pouring money onto their pockets in order to save them, etc., etc. So that crisis that is being avoided is a non-event. So these events happen that can actually, they are more difficult to measure. They're more difficult to observe, but they can explain what happens on the surface. Okay, so Marx said, for instance, on the surface, you see supply and demand determines the prices, etc., etc. But what goes behind this is actually the exploitation of the labor, because if you don't have the labor, nothing would come out. And therefore, you have to pay attention to how production relations are set up. Okay, so it's the value of the labor that goes into the products that actually, at the end of the day, explains the value of the products out there, because those fluctuations, supplies and demands, they all gravitate around one price. Even if the supply and demand are equal, there's equal supply for the equal demand, there is still a price for that product. Where does that price come from? Well, then he says it comes from what actually the laborer puts into the products. So you see that this is you dig a layer further down, okay, deeper, and then is that all? Are we finished now? Are we satisfied? Well, no. The critical realist said, no. Look deeper and see how, for instance, the primitive accumulation happened, because a worker or a laborer thinks that they have no rights over the products because a rich guy has invested in the company. So I'm employed, I got my wage, my payment on the payday, and I have no rights over what I'm producing because this guy owns everything. But then the question is that, where does that ownership come from? Well, and then you have to trace it back and you say, whoa. Historically, that money didn't come out of blue. That money was kind of confiscated through colonization, grabbing lands historically, and then has been transferred from one generation to another generation until the rich guy who is employing me claims ownership over everything. Okay, so see that primitive accumulation, the enclosure of common lands, the commodity fetishism, etc., etc. So the historical patterns of class struggles. You have to look at things more deeply, and you see that, oh wow, they're much more, but they are also much more difficult to measure. They are much more difficult to turn to numbers, and they're much more abstract, but they're much more powerful. So this is reproduction. This is that you bring things backward. You move from the effect to the cause, and you see that this is powerful way of explaining things. You rarely find such things in social sciences these days, unfortunately. But there are people who do this, and they want to actually explain things in terms of their very root causes. Any questions? Now, I know I'm giving you a bad headache, but remember, these things will sit in your subconscious. You don't need to really memorize them. We're just trying to make sense of things. And then later on, when you read the book, maybe, or you come back to this, if the book is too scary, you come back to these slides, they would hopefully make more sense. And they pave the way for later on when we want to really apply this in real cases. Okay. So another step you want to take is to actually clarify what we mean by mechanisms and processes. Again, scary things. But as soon as we understand them, we'll see they're not that scary. They're not the boogeyman. You see that there is a bit of a problem here, which I didn't raise with you. They talk a lot about mechanisms and processes. Let's say these are causal mechanisms. Causal mechanisms mean they have some kind of causal effect on the upper level. But what exactly they mean by mechanisms? What exactly they mean by processes? Something turns from something to another thing, as a process. And can we really differentiate it in 3 levels, or the boundaries are kind of fuzzy? In reality, practically, you'll see. I mean, I forced myself practically when I was preparing this to put this here rather than here, right? I mean, if you were yourself, you would have find yourself in this kind of situation, weird situation. How I can decide that historical patterns of class struggles belong to the real, not to the actual? Is that because they're harder to measure? Or is that because they're more abstract? Why they're not events or non-events? Why they should go into the real rather than actual, or vice versa? Yeah.
I think we should not go to the actual part, because
Yep.
the real would be the answer of why this
Why
happens.
there's, yes.
So it's actually not the very point.
Yes, yeah. So we can disagree with each other. We can say, as you said, and I tend to agree, that maybe this needs to go up there. But then as soon as you put something up there and you raise a why question, because you can constantly raise the why question. Why? And the more you ask why, the more you have to go deeper. So practically, someone, okay, yes.
Yeah, so I was about to say, I think that the stratification is not fixed. So in that way, it's very fluid. So like now we can probably see those stuff as like the real, but then after a couple of years or after more digging, we'll probably move it to the actual and find something more real. And then, after more digging, you just
you keep pushing things
down.
up. Yes.
Pushing things up and then
Yes.
digging down.
Digging
until
down.
you get to, like,
Yes.
the realest real that you can.
Yes, well done. That's a very good point. Yes, absolutely. So that means the boundaries are fuzzy, they're flexible, as you said, they're fluid. So if that's the case, why not removing them? And why not changing our terminology a little bit to be reflective of that flexibility? That's the idea in the book. So the book says, well, if that's the case, the solution would be using prefixes like infra and meta. And what do we mean by infra and meta? So we can talk about infra-processes or meta-processes. We can talk about infra-mechanisms and meta-mechanism. What do we really mean by that? Well, if you remember, there's such a graph inside the book, figure of 3.1. And then it says, instead of actually dividing the reality between layers, we can consider a continuum of many why questions, as you said. So the deeper you go, the prefix infra means below, right? Like infrared, below red, right? And meta means above, like ultra. Meta means above something. So the ones that are on the top are actually the ones that emerge are more meta than the ones that are below that are more infra, right? And again, you dig, as you said, you dig deeper, you add more infra. You look at the upper levels, you move things up, you talk more about meta. Now, for instance, the book talks about reification as infra for commodification, and commodification infra for economic liberalization, and economic liberalization is as infra for economic globalization. What do we mean by that? Again, reification, commodification, scary words, but we deal with them a lot in social sciences. Especially in a leftist version of it, or critical social theory. Reification, anyone knows about reification? What reification means? Reify. Okay, you're getting close. Making things, I would say, objectified. Objectified. Now, like what? Imagine you are making a sandwich for a family member, your child, your siblings, or your parents. Yeah.
Like you're making a sandwich for the sake of making a sandwich.
Okay, let's not get for the sake part of it. You just putting your labor, your mind, your plan, your ideas, whatever about how to make a sandwich, for what purpose, etc., which are all kind of embedded in you, and you turn that into a sandwich, a product, and that sandwich objectifies your labor, right? As an objectified version of your creativity. So concretize something, yes. So to this point, you see a reification happen. An object comes out of something that was kind of abstract, right? Hard to consider as object. Now, that sandwich that you made is reification. Well, as you said, for your child, it is still reification. But imagine that you go into using a lot of sandwiches to sell, okay, and to make money out of it. And here now you are actually taking another step forward, and you are making that reified thing or objectified thing, objectified version of your labor into a commodity for exchange with money or with other commodities. Now you have commodified it because now it's in the market, right? So it was impossible to go for commodification without reification in this case, right? So you had to actually first go for reifying, then you go for commodifying. Now that things have become commodified, even your own labor, you can be employed by a factory to make sandwiches and get your wage, right? Your labor even becomes a commodity itself. And now that you have a market of so many commodities being exchanged, you can actually talk about market exchanges. Now you can even talk about economic liberalization. That in that process, you allow the commodities and the money to flow as freely as possible, right? That is called economic liberalization. That wouldn't be possible without commodification happening, without markets emerging, right? And now that you have liberalized your economy and allow for least interferences by the government and making the flows of goods and services uh, more possible, etc., etc. You cannot talk about economic globalization. Now remove the boundaries and borders. The society is getting involved in this free market, free trade exchanges, etc., etc. That wouldn't have been possible without economic liberalization. So you see that these are the infra, and this one is an infra for this one, but it's a meta for this one, right? Etc. 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 Just as an example. Just as an example. And people talk about modernization, etc. etc. Other processes. So you see that there are multi layers of process, and each process is kind of necessitates the other process, and the other process emerges out of the former process. Now, here is so let me get back to one of the slides because I kind of skipped that quickly. Oh, this was a quote from Marx that shows that Marx has kind of a sympathy with critical realism. Remember, we're going to bring four traditions together in conversation. The Marxian approach, the critical realist approach, Aristotelian approach, and the normative theory. It is important to show they are compatible. If they're not compatible, you can't bring them together. You can't piece them together in order to set up the foundation for your theory as a meta theory. So we have to say, actually, Marx had the strong elements of critical realism. Critical realists actually, in early stages, they looked at Marx and they were very much inspired by Marxian method. Critical realists actually draw on Aristotelian. They're fine with Aristotelian. There are very interesting overlaps between critical realists and Aristotelian doctrine of causes. Aristotle also talked about reality being multi-layer. In the fact that he differentiates between final cause and he puts final cause above the other causes, right? The cause of all causes, then that shows that he also was looking at the reality in a multi-layered way, right? And normative theory that actually talks about the true value, what should be valued versus what is being valued, that is also compatible with the rest of them. Now, let's see how, because we thought Marx was very much into okay, in terms of the compatibility of Marx and critical realism. Okay, you remember critical realists were not very satisfied with positivism. They were not satisfied with constructivism. They wanted to bring agency and a structure together. No quote from anyone in the world would grasp that mentality as beautiful as this one. That comes from Marx. And he says, men makes, excuse the language, men meaning human, women and non-duality. Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do their, but they not as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves. But they are still making it, right? They're still making it. But under circumstances directly found and given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the living. And that's from that book. So you see that he is bringing the agency of humanity and a structure together. Yes, we make the world, we do worlding. That's one of the concepts in critical realism. We ontologize, we do worlding, we make new words. But it's not everything is under our own control. There's a lot of circumstances that condition us. So that's exactly what critical realists would say. Conditioning. The structures conditions our agency, and our agency bend those conditions in return. That's why the history keeps moving forward. No decade is like the decade before. right? No year, no day is like the day before. So, but still you see many similarities. You still see exploitation happening. You see still the struggles are happening. So you see both continuities and discontinuities as well. So that was about how Marx and critical realism can come together. Then moving to this one. Yeah, sorry. This one. Well, we initially said that Marx paid a lot of attention to the inner workings of capitalism, and his perception of value had no value, no normative value, no ethical or moral value. He accepted the value as it was defined by capital, and just showed that where it does, where value comes, it comes from labor. It's embedded in the commodities, goods, and services, and it's being circulated across the system in order to maximize profit, right? But he also used an interesting method that is called contrastive explanation. Again, a scary word, but simple in meaning. I'll tell you what. And it actually helps you in your research if you decide to do research later. Instead of saying why this is happening, contrastive explanation raises a different question, an interesting one. It says, why this rather than that? Okay, why this rather than that? And why I'm here doing this bloody course that gives me headache rather than doing another course that could have been much more fun, right? That's the contrastive explanation, right? So you said Marx talked about workers being alienated, being disconnected, dislocated from their production, from their own humanity, etc., because they lose their agency. But they also, he said, why not being creative? Why not finding themselves in a different place where they could not be alienated? Yeah.
So kind of in the contrastive explanation,
Yes.
it's kind of alluding to true value in that sense.
Yes. Exactly.
Because why this is the part that's referring to the fetish value.
Yes.
And then the rather than that is
exactly beautiful. Yes. So you see that you can. That's why I say he opened the door. He kept the doors open for becoming normative. Yeah, he was not normative himself. He was very analytical, super analytical. But by taking this method, he actually left the doors open for us. So when we say we go beyond Marx with Marx, that is because he kept the doors open. So we can take him out of his grave and take him with us to expand his theory. And I don't think he would oppose us. It would be very upset. So now, actually, he looked at other things, non-capitalist or post-capitalist ways of doing things in his work. But guess the problem? What was the problem? Let me first look at what he did. He actually, if you look at his work, you see him discussing and making references to the primitive communities of hunters in North Africa and free Americans of the colonies, to the ancient and medieval communities of farmers, to nomadic societies of Asia, to ancient communes in Paris commune, even the slavery and serfdom-based production, as well as the antiquated forms of interest-bearing capital, different types of capitalism he looked at. He looked at the commons, even the forms of commons. He talked about, this is a phrase that is very much attributed to Marx, the association of free and equal producers. Even imagine that, okay? So he talked about communes that are non-capitalist. He talked about indigenous who are non-capitalist. He talked about the Asian ways of doing things, producing things that are non-capitalist. So we looked at so many examples of non-capitalists. But the problem was that he did that in order to make the case about how special capitalism is or how different capitalism is. He did not include any of one of these non-capitalist ways of doing into his value theory. So his value theory is still very much limited on how value is produced and confiscated or appropriated under capitalism, how laborers are exploited, etc., etc. But you don't see any of this in his value theory. He has done it outside his value theory, but not inside value theory. But as you said, now we can follow his method and say, okay, why fetish value rather than true value? And by raising that question, we can do Marx a favor by making Marx actually more normative. I think I should stop that. It's a little bit extra things, I wouldn't confuse you with these two terms. You can disregard that, because this is about where actually, when we talk about normative, when we talk about what should be value, where does that come from? What if I'm different to compared to you about what should be valued? And what is the position? What Marx what was the Marxian position about what should be valued and what shouldn't be valued? And there are two approaches. One is immanentist and the other is transcendentalist. Again, it adds to your headache, but again, they're super simple. And immanentist, like Marx would say, I will leave it to the people to decide why I should say anything about what should be valued. We'll just talk about normative value, just about true value, but in practice, we'll leave it to people to decide. We'll look at how people their struggles. So it's embedded in the reality already. It's up to people. And if they decide what is actually adds to their good life, that is true value. I'm not in a position as a philosopher to say what they should value, what humanity should value. I'm not Kant. Kant would do that. Immanuel Kant. Or Kant. Is that in German? Is it Kant? Yes.
It's very close to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. That's the proper way to pronounce it.
Yes. So Kantians would say, no. It's wow. What if a society, 100% of them decide to become fascist? Would that make fascism a value? So they're not happy with Marx in that way. So where does really the value comes from? If you just leave it to people and their actual experiences and etc. Marx said the true value comes out of the workers' struggle, workers' fight. When they get involved into fighting, they realize how valuable justice is. Like, women who were involved in civil rights movements. They realize, oops, we're all fighting for the civil rights, but it seems that women are inferior to men in that, in those movements. So feminist movement came out of the second wave of that came out of the civil rights movement because of the discrimination and inferiority that they experience in that struggle. And Marx says, yeah, let's do that. That's the value comes from those struggles. But the Kantians would say, oh, wait a minute. What if it doesn't? What if people ends up like in Germany again? A lot of people would worship Adolf Hitler. Is that right?
If we take the quote again, that would mean that they would not properly choose value because it was just like it's based on the current situations, like kind of traditions and whatever they were doing. So it would not be a free choice. So in that way, I would say we wouldn't need a philosopher to say that's what it should be. Then you would need to find a way there because obviously you would not be more out of the current situation.
Yeah. Well, those conditions actually make people to go for fascism, right? that what you say? And then you change those conditions, you may not end up doing that. Anyway, this is an endless conversation between philosophers, and we don't deal with that. I just touched upon that just in case if I haven't given you enough headaches. Okay. So any questions? Let me know. But do you think we have learned something valuable? Mechanisms, processes, infra, meta, how critical realism helps. But now we will move forward. In chapter 4, we'll go back to that model. And this is a method theoretical backing. We know we are stepping on a very solid floor now, and then we'll develop the model. The model that can actually explain us how actually decommonization and recommunization can happen, and where capitalism gets its power and where it can lose. Okay. Let me know if you have any questions about what we just said, or this first assignment, if you have any question about that one. Yes?
I just have a question about meta theory. We said it was like a theory that theorizes theories.
Yes.
Can we put it against sort of every theory that we have and say the meta theory of this theory? Is that sort of how it works?
Yes.
Or is it just a theory on its own of theories?
Yes. For instance, in your thesis, you want to explain, just name something, a social issue, a social problem. What would be the precariety of labor? Why more and more people find themselves in very poor working conditions, for instance. So you have a theory. You want to explain why this happens. And then you need a theory about your theory. I would say if you're going to go positivist and measure everything and do a social survey of people and put everything into numbers, or you want to go and sit with a bunch of casuals and talk about how they are experiencing, what they are experiencing, how they are experiencing things, the precarity of their working conditions, etc., etc. Or you want to go both ways, or you want to say, okay, well, I'm going to talk to people. I'm not going, that is just a perceptions and experiences, but I'm going to investigate why in this society this precarity is happening. These working conditions are happening. Then you look into the policies, you look into the politics, you look into other things.
Those things are the metaphor of the
No. The method theory is the one that gives you the direction, how to explain things. It's on the background. The method theory would just tell you, in just roughly speaking, in social sciences, it would just tell you how to do. The positivism is a method theory.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Constructionism is a method theory.
Yeah.
And critical realism is another method theory.
Yeah.
So there's three competing paradigms. Yeah. So method theory can't explain why there is an unemployment or underemployment or poor conditions or poverty or housing prices. But method theory can actually guide you to get there. Method theory can tell you how you can theorize it, how you want to theorize it. Yes?
So theory is kind of like your hypothesis of how something works.
Yes.
And then meta theory is the methodology of how do you want to go about that question. So, for example, if I say unemployment is high because of these policies, that's the theory. But then how I want to go about that question, that would be the meta theory.
Yes. The reason that you refer to policies and politics and the capitalist relations, etc., is because you have already adopted critical realism. If you were not adopting critical realism as your method theory, you would have ended up having interviewing 15 people about how they are experiencing unemployment, for instance, which has its own value. I'm not questioning that. I'm not questioning that. Positivism has, I've done a lot of data gathering and data mining and surveying. I love quantitative. I love crunching numbers. But I know it's just a scratching surface. If I want to get deeper, another layer deeper, I have to interview people. For instance, if I see that, I don't know, less educated people are more likely to be unemployed, I want to know what actually happens deep down in their experiences that relates education to unemployment. So I have to interview people. Okay, how are you finding your lack of education affecting your lack of a secure job, right? But then again, that's still one layer deeper. But I want to get even deeper than that. Where does that come from? And then I have to look into the politics, the economy, the structure, the way the society is structured. Where does that start? Where the why question starts? I would say it starts at the level where you explain things that are inherent, intrinsic in the nature of the system itself, the dominant system. It's where you can actually say, okay, it's enough. Now I can't really get further down because now I know that it's the way the capitalist relations are set up is very much is what explains what capitalism is. That's where the deepest level. I'm not sure if it can get deeper than that. Maybe then we have to go very historical, human nature and those sort of things. I can go very wide. Okay. Any other questions? Anything that I can say in order to clarify things? Anything that puzzles you? What's your hypothesis? Yes.
But I'm just wondering, in other courses, when we've written essays about theories, I'm not sure they kind of want us to explain those theories in a way. Are you wanting us to write essays that incorporate like an explanation of the theory as if the reader has no idea what it is, or just write them? That makes sense.
Possibly in the second assignment, it's more about kind of it's like the open questions. It's about how we have it's to test how we have understood chapter 3 and 4. It's a very abstract. For the final assignment, if you look at the final assignment, the third one, it's about the application of this theory, which you call it communist value theory. The communist value theory is explains capitalism by bringing true value and finished value together. So it's the contrastive explanation. Why it's not the other one, not rather than that. So with the so in the first assignment, part C. What it says, it says find the sector like the food production, right? Remember that food production, and explain what happens in the food production in terms of the true value production, etc. And use that kind of suppose. Now, the final assignment is the expanded version of that. In a full assignment, we want to again choose a sector and use the theory that we have learned. That model that we will talk about, decommonization and recolonization in the case of that. So it's an extended version of part C. So if you do a good job in terms of part C of first assignment, that would be a solid base for the final assignment. Okay, yes.
How we write it, do you want to know just when if we're writing to someone who doesn't know, if you want us to write it straight up, less late and more straight. That's what I'm
Oh, sorry, I can do this. Um, okay, that's a very, very interesting question. If we want to do it in a way that you're writing it for someone who doesn't understand any one of this, that would become a text would be. It would be, you have to write many, many pages.
Yeah.
I think you have to find somewhere in between. Yes, it would be drawing on the book. Yeah, you assume that we all know. Yeah, you assume that. I think that would be more comfortable.
Okay.
Otherwise, you will end up writing the text would be much more difficult. Is that?
That's what I mean. Yeah,
Yes.
kind of.
Do you think that would be better? I mean, it's the first time I'm doing it. So any feedback from you? Just tell me what would make it less useful.
I feel like previously I've written a lot of explanations of theory and analyze it, like kind of
Yes.
explain it first to the audience and analyze it. Is that explanation just like what are you doing there and analyze it?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's about the application of the theory that we have there. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay, if there is no questions, we can possibly end the session. Thank you for being patient, and all the best. So again, if you have any questions about your assignment, don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. We can also have, I don't know, would this Friday noontime work for anyone? If not, okay, gosh. So I have chosen a time that doesn't fit anyone.